It's my great pleasure to have Dr. Charles Wessner here with us this evening. He's an international expert on innovation policy. He's the founder and director of the Technology, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Academies. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the National Academies, it's a tremendous honor to become a fellow of the National Academy. One that I would aspire to. Charles, just put in a word for me there if you can. Charles advises governments all over the world, including his own, obviously. He's worked with the White House and Congress, and he advises governments in Europe and in Asia, extensively in Asia. He's worked with the OECD. And it's a great pleasure for us to have had him in Ireland for the past week. This is his first ever visit to Ireland. And he spent a week both north and in the Republic looking at what we're doing, listening, speaking, and basically getting a feel for activities north and in the Republic. And it's my great pleasure to say that he's going to be talking on the innovation imperative this evening and providing us some insights in what's happening in the US and also what he sees here in Ireland. So thank you very much, Charles, for your time, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here. I had a grandmother who was born up farther north, who migrated to the U.S. under some difficult circumstances in the in the end of the 1800s, where she ran into a German, and they had several daughters and sons, and probably in your best tradition, in the 1930s, all of her daughters went on to college, college was relatively unusual, and daughters even more so. And then my father met someone from an English family by the name of Wakefield, and you get an American called Charles. So it's a genuine pleasure to be here, and I'd like to express a special thanks to Professor Jarvis for her kindness in organizing a remarkable series of events here. And I would equally like to thank her colleague and partner in crime, Basil McRae, a member of the Northern Ireland Parliament, and someone who they both understand the importance of transatlantic cooperation. If any of you are interested in compliments, you can get an OECD report, and they'll say lots of nice things about Ireland. If you like to hear some unvarnished observations, then you've come to the right place. I just would like to stress that these are my personal views, and they are not the views of the National Academy of Sciences. I just got off the phone with the White House, where they're trying to get a report cleared to speak at a meeting we're having on October 11th on manufacturing. And I think we can probably get the clearance by October 14th. But I'm not sure that'll meet our needs, or for that matter, the needs of the government. But one of the things, this is rather large, isn't it? One of the things that I'd like to talk to you about is what we call the global innovation imperative. It's very simple that the innovative capacity of a country is tightly linked with its potential for growth, for jobs, and for security. In part, what I want to talk to you particularly about is, as Irish, is the question is, do you retain the position you have in the world today as a country that until recently was growing very rapidly and had an outstanding reputation as a place to invest for leading companies, or do you slide back behind some of the rapidly growing Asian countries? And I note, as always in all of my talks, that there is a large contingent of our our friends and colleagues from Asia. Many of the younger people from Ireland are having a beer. And I think this captures some of the problems we have in the United States. The leading countries are focused on growth and on national strength. They're supporting their universities, funding research, trying to figure out how to help small business. And they're doing this with an intensity that is remarkable. And one of the things they're also doing is trying to focus on keeping the existing industries that they have, what economists like to talk about as traditional industries. In fact, economists' favorite expression is to talk about these industries as commodity industries. Now, if you don't know what a commodity industry is, it's something in which you don't work, because it's the other guy's job. And if you're a professor who deeply believes in the market, in fact, is so deeply committed to the market that the first thing you do is get tenure to avoid those rapidly moving market forces. And then you can tell people in other industries that it's right and just that they should lose their job. Something that I think you really need to focus on is often if those guys are losing their job, it's not because of some pure market force. It is because another country has decided they want the industry. Now, they don't do a lot to get the industry. They may provide free capital. They may borrow the intellectual property and forget to pay for it. They may move several thousand people to work near the plant. They may not pay them very high wages or health care. And they may close their domestic market. You're beginning to get the idea they actually work pretty hard at doing this. Many of these things, I would point out, have been invented in Europe. But it's what they're doing. And as a result is you have countries, we have both a yin and a yang here. And my friends yin and yang will be active all the way through this discussion. Because in part, China, Brazil, and India have done probably the most fabulous job for human welfare that we have ever seen. Hundreds of millions of people, roughly about 1 billion people, have moved into the middle class as a result. You know, I love to say that, you know, only about 300 or 400 million people in India are in the middle class. In other terms, that might be called Europe, you know. Now, they have more to go, but what they've done is already very, very impressive. As a result, they're new innovation hubs. But in some cases, you know, it's just a restoration. I enjoy reminding some of my students in Washington. Does anyone know what were the 3 main financial centers in 1912? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Anyone here study economics ever? None of you studied it. You won't admit to studying economics. Well, they were London, of course. And if you pause for a second, New York, of course. But the third one is the tricky one, because the third one was Shanghai in 1912. But 1912 was also the year where the Chinese Revolution began, and revolutions and financial centers often don't go well together, something the British government has always kept firmly in mind. So the broader point is that there's an unprecedented flow of knowledge, money, and talent across borders. And that means that there are opportunities for Ireland to capture companies and activities which would have been unthinkable 30 years ago, and certainly 40 years ago. But today you take it for granted. The trick is you should take for granted your capacity to attract them, but you should not take for granted any certainty that you'll keep them. China, I think, is an incredibly powerful model. Why? And I like to joke, and I'd like to particularly to speak to some of the people, this is a joke, okay? So China is cheating. They are investing in universities, they're investing in broadband, they're investing in highways, they're investing in their kids, they're sending them to school, and they even require them to study. Now, isn't that unfair? They should model themselves after the Americans, where you don't study, and the adults let you do that, and in exchange, they borrow money for their current expenditure that you'll have to pay back. It's such a deal. We're living off older infrastructure. We're not investing enough in our universities, and I'll talk more about that. But it is really quite remarkable, the sustained effort that China is making. But, in Ireland, they like to say, well, China's huge, it's 1.2 billion people. How about Singapore? How about 4.5 million? Another case of cheating. Look at A-Star. Billions of dollars for the infrastructure. Another strange thing is the Singaporeans clearly must not be as smart as you are here in Ireland, because they think they need to attract talent from all over the world, whereas you don't. You know the joke about an American university? Anybody familiar with that? Aside from my two suffering accomplices here. The description of an American university is it's a group of Russians teaching mathematics to Chinese. That's what an American university is. But it's both funny and true. Why the Russians? Because they're really good in math. Why the Chinese? Because they're smart and really eager to learn. And why do we have foreigners in both cases? Because we recruit the best and the brightest. I was kidding some of our Czech friends the other day that we were very pleased that they were so much smarter than we are, because they are able to do this all by themselves. Look at this investment. Despite the efforts of the Commission, if you look at where some of these, I'm actually missing, well, you get the idea here. Asia collectively is surging on a regional perspective. And it's important to keep in mind that if you invest in research and develop long enough, you will eventually get something. That said, it's important to remember, and it's always important to remember, that these are input measures. The OECD loves to collect input measures and is very, very careful about output measures. It's not just what you put in, it's what you get out. So these are the things that Ireland is doing. Ireland clearly recognizes the challenges they're facing. And I think they've got some really very positive goals here. Outstanding research and innovation-driven culture. And these are some of the goals: to work more closely with industry, branding, recruit internationally, and invest. And to this government's credit, in this very difficult time, they have continued to invest in the educational system, continued to invest in research and training. I think we can have some questions later on about how they might work more closely with industry. Now, before I raise too many questions about Ireland, let me talk a little bit about my favorite country. And in my favorite way is that there's good news and there's bad news. Americans like to point that out. The old joke, the good news, I found your car, the bad news, it's in a creek. So in any case, this is one of the greatest strengths of America, and it's something that is very important not to neglect. First, we remain openness to science and education. For the most part, although there have been some notable exceptions lately, we believe what the scientists tell us. I was amazed in some of the energy debates recently where there seemed to be a great deal of skepticism on the part of some young people with whether the scientists were right or whether they had, because they provide information that was not consistent with what was already believed, then there's some question. We place a very high value in commercial success. There's a joke in France that if somebody really succeeded, they always want to know how he cheated. We also have forgiving social norms. You're allowed to try more than once. And that's partly because there are these general bankruptcy laws that let you recycle quickly. People like to nod about this. Oh, it's interesting, the Americans do that. That's Silicon Valley. Well, I'll tell you what. Remember the goal, the Irish government's goal? Do you want an innovation-driven economy? Well, how do you expect to have a winning soccer team if you're going to make anyone who misses a shot sit out for the next 4 games? Would that make sense? No. No, it wouldn't. But you do what? 3 years here now? Big reform? Instead of 12 years, it's 3 years before you're allowed to own and operate a company again? Is that smart? What does that bring you? Now, I think we should just try and be fair. Personally, I think we should do the same thing with parliamentarians that we do with entrepreneurs. So if a guy runs for election and he misses it, then for 10 years or so, he should not be allowed to run again. So far, that has not been widely adopted, but I think it would sort of capture the point that maybe you don't want to do that. Also, the strong intellectual property regime. I spoke last Wednesday, which seems a long time ago now, but about 10 days ago, we had a meeting with the National Development and Reform Commission. That's the group that is basically running the Chinese economy. And one of the things that some parts of that group were very supportive of is the importance of a tight intellectual property regime. Why? Because as China invests more and more in research and develops more things, part of the government has understood that if you can't protect the intellectual property, then you can't bring in the capital and know-how necessary to develop those ideas. The IP is not designed to deny things to the world. It's designed to help you bring those things to market. This is a big good news story. If you look at the US contribution, we're about 1/3 of the world total. It's a very porous system. It's one that you can easily cooperate in. And it's one that if you left here with one idea tonight, well, that would be a couple too few, but at least one should be that there's opportunities to cooperate in the US system that are unparalleled. If you look at this, the red here is the roughly $30 to $32 billion that we spend on health research. Just in perspective, that's that's close to the Czech and Hungarian economies and perhaps one or two other economies combined. That's what we spend on healthcare. We spend vastly more than healthcare research. We spend vastly more than any other part of the world. And it's essentially open. And it does a lot of things. There's a big space for computational science. You know that we have world-class universities that are open to cooperation. But it's probably really important to emphasize that the breadth and depth and diversity of US universities. I would just plead with you on behalf of my colleagues at MIT, there are other universities in the 250 research universities. And a lot of them are extremely good, often specialized and able to work effectively with your own outstanding universities. And I've had the pleasure of visiting a number of these, and I've seen some best practice facilities that would enable you to cooperate with anyone. Now, these are some of the problems that we're facing. I'm going to talk about Irish challenges, but also U.S. challenges. But probably the most important challenge the United States faces today is complacency about where we are in the world. There are, unfortunately, a lot of members of our Congress that seem to just take it for granted that we're competitive and we're going to stay competitive because we're Americans. We have this great line that every president seems to fall into, that, on a level playing field, American workers can outcompete anyone in the world. Oh, really? Well, let me explain something to you. First, there's no level playing field, okay? The world is, a friend of mine, venture capitalist in California, Michael Boris, has said, the globe is not flat, it's tilted. So every country, as I mentioned, is working very hard, both in good ways and sometimes not so good ways, to tilt the field in their competitive advantage. And the other, frankly, is a lot of American workers could use some remedial reading and math skills. BMW has to dumb down some of their manuals when they build cars in South Carolina. So we have things that we need to do. We also are not focusing enough on the composition of our economy. Our trade and investment policy is, to a large extent, designed to help us win the Cold War. I was literally, just if you want to talk about different perspectives, our friends in the State Department were arguing that we needed to give the Koreans a favorable trade agreement to show them our commitment. Our commitment, for heaven's sakes, we've had 40,000 troops there for the last 50 years. If they're attacked, it's an American commander's in charge, and we have 2 fleets assigned to defend them. I think that passes for commitment. On the other hand, the Koreans are going to clean our clocks in the car industry. They make really effective cars. They started off with Kias. I was in 1998 in the Blue House, that's the White House in Korea, and they explained that they were going to build cars. I said, why would you do that? There's a huge car glut. And the guy looked at me and said, we are going to build cars on this peninsula and export them to the rest of the world. And I said, how are you going to make money at that? And he looked at me, and I could see him thinking, I'm in a chaebol. Why would I have to make money? You know, I'll have market share. And when your companies are gone, we'll make money. So it's a different system. I'm not attacking the Koreans, mind you. I'm just explaining it's a different system. So the Obama administration has launched a comprehensive innovation strategy. If you're not familiar, this is our president. And some people hope he will remain our president. And if you've been following the American news, Mr. Romney seems to be working hard to keep him as our president, but that's, you know, go for it. These are the things that he's doing. He's trying to invest more in R&D, grow and attract a skilled workforce. We've had serious problems with visas. You know, if it weren't so serious, it would actually be funny. You know, we're attacked by a group of Saudi Arabians from western Saudi Arabia. So what do? We keep German physicists and Indian doctors from coming into the country. Hello? You know, what was the problem? They've reformed our patent system. We reformed our patent system to align it more on the rest of the world because we thought that was important. We're investing in clean energy, and we've broken away from the economists' what some would call the economist Kool-Aid, that advanced countries don't need to manufacture. They can just do services. But increasingly, it's understood that that simply is not the case. These are some of the questions we're facing. These are really tough questions for the U.S. This is what the Academy asks. You know, the political question is, can we get all these things enacted that the president wants to do? The really tough question that many Europeans don't like to answer, you know, will it work? You know, you have to avoid falling into what I call the Cold War trap. You know, in the Cold War, when we were afraid of Russia and concerned about communism, if the Defense Department was making investment in a weapons system and you asked, are you sure that's performing properly? They'd say, are you soft on communism? No, I was just saying that that weapon system doesn't seem to actually, you know, take off or land like it's supposed to. That's the same problem you get with innovation investments here and elsewhere. You know, we're investing in innovation, we're investing in research, so you shouldn't ask any questions about whether it works or whether you're getting an output. And measuring that is tough. So both the president and his rival claim that they're interested in innovation policy, but both also fall into this great Washington debate about whether or not the government should be involved. Now, this is kind of funny, but many people in the U.S., particularly senators, like to say, and you always have to catch this right, because done with it's like you're repeating one of the 10 Commandments, you know, the government should not pick winners and losers. I always like to joke, yeah, of course not. They should pick winners. Winners are more fun, and you don't need to pick the losers. In fact, the government does pick losers all the time. There was a company called McDonnell Douglas, and the government decided that they would go out of business, and they would give being a loser, and Boeing would be the winner. And when that contract was granted, they were done. The fact is, the U.S. government has had a long history in doing this stuff. I'll go through this very quickly, but it is kind of funny, because there was a time in the U.S. when we did not pick winners and losers, when we did not invest in new industries. But that was from about 1792 to about 1798. After that, this is a funny story, actually. We were very angry with the French and the British. It's probably hard for you to imagine being angry with the British, but we were. And the problem was that if you wanted to buy muskets to show how angry you were, there were two main places you could get muskets, in France and in England. And they also had this problem, they actually controlled the oceans. So we decided we would make muskets ourselves. And a brilliant guy by the name of Eli Whitney came up with a plan to make interchangeable musket parts. And so we established a long tradition. He was given funds, and he promised within 2 years to come back with the product. In fact, it cost 3 times what it was supposed to cost, and it took 10 years, thereby establishing our tradition of defense procurement. But the fact is that that evolved into the American system of manufacturers, into a machine tool system that we then exported in the 1830s and the 1840s to countries like Great Britain. Samuel Morse, largely known as the inventor of the telegraph, was in fact a portrait artist, interesting, a portrait artist who proposed to the Congress in 1837 that if they gave him $30,000, he could build a system that could transmit signals down a wire. The Congress debated that for 5 years. Some in Congress were convinced that God did not intend us to send signals down a wire. They were right, of course. It was meant to be wireless, but it took us a while to get there. The Wright brothers are not widely known. It was done on an Army contract. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was a source of many of the breakthroughs that enable us to develop aircraft. The Navy set up the Radio Corporation of America. By the way, I'd just like to remind those of your students here, when I was in school, I studied economics. I'm a treasury economist. Nobody ever taught me this stuff. You know, I was taught that you had an idea, you got money from the market, and off you went developing your idea. And I suppose that happened sometimes, but it wasn't true for radar, jet aircraft, computers, satellites. You know, we've always had to learn from other people. I love the father of the American space program, Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun was an acquired acquisition. He was also the father of the V2 program that did such destruction in London. And today, the government is funding nanotechnologies, biomedical research, flexible electronics, all the things that are going to be the industries of tomorrow. And if you don't mind me putting this up, we were actually using this before The Economist blessed it, but it's really pretty funny. There are a lot of Americans who go around acting like the US government never does anything for them, the same way these Jewish patriots seem to argue that the Romans had never done anything for them. And you shouldn't forget the wine, I would point out. So we can do this. We can rebuild our innovation and manufacturing base, but there's some things we have to do, and perhaps first and foremost among that is to pay attention to what the rest of the world is doing and to get our house in order. If you look at the bottom of the slide, some people think that the way forward is to cut taxes, cut regulations, cut investments. One of the things that deeply concerns me about Europe today is that everyone seems to think if they reduce demand, they'll grow their economies. I don't know whether anyone has looked back, but we actually tried this in the early 1930s. It was not a resounding success. And the main way we grew out of the Depression, of course, has some problems because it involves World War II, and we're not interested in doing that again. So the question we have is, how are we going to do this? And I have a suggestion here. This is a US-oriented point, but I really feel compelled to make it. And I think it has important lessons for here. In 2000, we had a growing economy, good employment, and a balanced budget, and we collected taxes. Since then, we have tried an experiment where we stopped collecting taxes by a third. We have not had a growing economy. We have high unemployment, and we're borrowing money for current expenditures that we want our children to pay back. I really don't see this as being fair in any intergenerational sense. To be honest, I'm actually appalled with what my generation is doing. Where do you think this deficit comes from? Do you think it has any linkage to the fact we've stopped collecting taxes? You know, people decry government expenditure in the US, but you know, in a depression, expenditures go up. And as a result, we're spending less on R&D as a share of GDP. And you compare that with some of the countries I've mentioned East Asia, but if you also look at Finland, there must be someone else who's not from East Asia here, or Germany, they're really doing pretty well. Now keep in mind, we're operating on a different base here, but I think it's worth making the point. So these are some of the things that we're thinking of doing, and we at the National Academies have been advising the government to do that. One is investment in growing our skilled workforce, but this is the tough part. Remember I was talking about measuring outputs? We invest a lot, and we don't do well in international comparisons. This is the thing that is the policymaker's nightmare. You are getting the money, and it isn't working. Every governor in the United States likes to make speeches about the knowledge economy and how important universities are, and then he goes back to his office and cuts their budget again. We know that over 50% of the startups in Silicon Valley come from Indian and Chinese immigrants, and yet we make it hard for Indian and Chinese immigrants to stay. The administration has been working hard on a whole series of things, and we could talk about any one of these individually. But we also need to work on our manufacturing. The economists were telling us here that not to worry, you'll keep the high-tech manufacturing, but it's natural that you'll lose the low-tech manufacturing. Well, the problem is we're losing a lot of the low-tech manufacturing and the high-tech. And as a result, the Obama administration has launched this new National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, because one of the things we're working very hard at doing is trying to figure out what ITRI is doing in Taiwan, what IRAP is doing in Canada. We're very interested in the Fraunhofer models and what I would call the Fraunhofer light models of Catapult in the UK and the Carnot Institutes in France. And what's my point here? My point is that the US, one of the largest and most dynamic economies on earth, we're trying to learn from our neighbors. And I think it's really important that you do the same thing. We also encourage small business entrepreneurship. Again, we're one of the most innovative countries. We have lots of small businesses. 4 out of 5 jobs in the US come from small businesses. Our large companies were small businesses, and we scaled. But we have a problem in the US. This is another one of the myths that we encounter. Have you ever heard this? Those of you who are interested in theology will recognize this. It's very Calvinistic in its approach. You can tell the blessed because they're wealthy, and if they're not wealthy, well, clearly they're not blessed. The problem is that new firms are hard to figure out. Will that idea work? I'll be happy to make this available to you. You don't have to take pictures of every slide. The problem is that there's this thing we call the Valley of Death. And it's a simple diagram. But I think, as Susie pointed out, I often talk to members of Congress, so we try and keep things fairly simple. The new ideas have trouble attracting the capital that they need to develop. And this is a critical point. These ideas here are often perfectly viable commercial ideas. They're perfectly good ideas. But if they don't have the management team they need, and if they can't get the early capital that they need, they won't develop. They'll languish there. So we have a program that provides funding to jumpstart innovation. I can spend the next 3 hours on this, but perhaps the next 3 minutes would be more appropriate. And basically what we do is we have, remember the $150 billion in public R&D. The government puts out a solicitation for things that they're trying to figure out. A classic one would be the river's polluted. Fine, what is it polluted with? How much of it is there? And what would we do about it? Or you need a new sonar system for a submarine. Or you need better gloves for special forces troops assigned to Afghanistan, or a better optical sight. The SBR's best practice features are that it's focused on the Valley of Death. It's a highly competitive program. It's a big enough program that you get a portfolio effect. And what do I mean by a portfolio effect? I mean a lot of shots on goal, because you don't know which one is going to succeed. And really importantly, it's decentralized. Each ministry has to allocate part of its budget to small business. Each ministry. So you don't have just one technology agency that knows everything making the decision. You've got lots of different industries that know their space making a decision about what might work. And the results have been pretty impressive. There's a lot of new firm creation, about 20 to 25%, but there's also a lot of company growth from the existing small businesses and a lot of partnering with universities. So let me conclude by arguing that this is what Ireland needs to do. Ireland needs to recognize not just that there's a crisis, but in a crisis you need to do things differently. You know the old joke that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is one form of insanity. You need innovative small companies to get growth, to get jobs. What do the small companies need? They need two really important things. They need sustained capital through the valley of death, and they need an opportunity. Marie Quinn has been very interested in this SBR program because it's one way of giving opportunities to small companies. But as we were joking today in a very interesting lunch discussion, only too often if you ask a procurement officer, would you work with a small company? He says, of course, we'll work with an innovative small company, any innovative small company, as long as they've been in existence for more than 5 years, have 10 years experience in running large projects, and have $50 million in the back. Yeah, we'll work with small companies. It is both funny and true. So small companies need that opportunities, and universities need to have the flexibility and the funding to help. One of the problems we have in the US is we're giving our universities less and less money and more regulation. And what you need is less regulation and more money. And I think you have a real problem here with this. I've learned this term. It's called an audit culture, where everybody has to be assured in 10 duplicate forms that everything will go right and all the T's have been crossed, and above all, the person making the grant is not responsible for anything if it goes wrong. You know, you have to remember we're playing a fast-moving game of football. You need to run harder, you need to pass and work together, and you need to shoot on goal again and again. So university leadership in particular needs to be able to take money to help small companies begin. They need to be able to reallocate money internally to encourage new courses and new initiatives. The Innovation and Entrepreneurship Center that Professor Jarvis has been working on is absolutely essential, the type of learning that's needed. So, just in closing, I would just like to point out that we have some of the same problems. We have the same need to learn together, and we have some opportunities to cooperate. And we look forward to working with you. Thanks very much for your attention.